kind of there is a realism that we have to take in the approach to like the longevity of these events once kind of the traditional format becomes accessible again, because obviously like the vast majority of these kind of digital only events are made as a supplement to what people are really after, or the substitution to something that people are really looking to do. But also, like you mentioned, there is a component of like accessibility for people who might not have the resources to access some of these bigger events. And kind of like you said, pertaining to like visas and things like that. Like that is something that is likely going to have kind of a long-lasting impact even after we see some of the world events surrounding COVID kind of die down a little bit as all of that gets kind of restored. So of course, there's a value to the accessibility that these events offer, but there is also that component of people just kind of chomping at the bit to get back into what's familiar and what ultimately seems to be more effective, traditionally speaking.
100%, especially coming from like an events organizer perspective. Like for some clarity, I used to work in events before I joined TAG as the publishing director. It's absolutely understandable that everyone is trying to still pull off their digital events in this day and age. At least I myself am not expecting any physical events to become normal again up until maybe, if things go well, spring 2021. But right now I wouldn't be betting my money on those opportunities being back around at that time. And a brand, it's like a digital or even a physical events brand needs to stay relevant and needs to be needs to continue to be at the forefront of everyone's minds, transitioning back into the physical landscape. So people want to spend the time that they have right now available on figuring out if the digital events space is for them. Sometimes they have financial commitments that push them to create events at this given time, or it's their only opportunity to make any sorts of income. So it's fully understandable why we're in a situation where there are dozens of events every month. Just saying, in the long run, I'm seeing things going back to maybe a split between these physical and digital events, and us lowering the overall amount of digital events in this landscape.
Yeah, totally makes sense. One thing I'm a little curious about too, and obviously, like you said, that over time this is going to be a transition. I mean, I think just in very general speaking here, everybody will be looking forward to that transition back to normal life, right? But
very much.
But in terms of like, I mean, we did a lot about talking about some opportunities and things like that. And maybe we don't have to speak to all these different groups, because I love how you really paraphrased and opened up with saying like, hey, let's break this down into two people, like consumers and businesses, essentially, right? But like, who do you think should be taking advantage of digital events? I know we established a little bit with like publishers, people who organize events, devs and studios, but I want to know what you think in terms of players. Should players be taking advantage of these events, and what are the best ways they can make the most out of it? Because this is so different too from a player perspective.
Definitely, especially with the next generation console coming around, or consoles coming around in a couple of months.
Right.
It's a unprecedented situation from a global pandemic perspective in this day and age, as well as just the timing of everything coming together. From a player perspective, I find the digital landscape of, let's call them like the B2C events, to be quite interesting. You're definitely missing the human connection, which is one of the primary reasons why I, as a consumer, used to go to Gamescom and PAX and so on, because you wanted to meet people in real life, in person. But the downside of many of those events were just standing in line for hours upon hours just to get a chance to actually play a game demo. That's not a problem anymore. You could simply download it off of a console backend, or off of Steam, or off of the Epic Game Store in this day and age during these digital events. Right now, we're wrapping up, or we've just wrapped up the digital Gamescom with a virtual or an online edition of the Indie Arena booth, and there's I believe 185 independent games available for you to check out. Some just to wish list with some overall marketing material, some with a demo live on Steam that you can simply download and get a better understanding of a title that you may have been excited about. And if prior to this digital landscape, a developer was based out of North America, you were based here out of Germany, then the chances of you getting a chance to actually play this demo in person were pretty low. Now, with everything transitioned into digital, it's pretty easy. You don't have to stand in line for half an hour at PAX. You don't have to spend $1,000 to travel across the globe to Tokyo Game Show. You can just simply download it. So I think it's a great opportunity to be part of a digital event. Question is, how do you balance this overload in terms of content? Everyone wants to become a part of this. We just had the Steam, what's the exact title? Steam Games Festival Spring Edition, I believe, a couple of months ago. Well, spring, so obviously a couple of months ago. We have the fall edition coming up later this year. The spring edition had, I believe, roughly around 1,000 demos available. So the whole natural curation aspect that you get through a limited show floor at a games convention completely is off the table. So that'll be a challenge moving forward of how do we figure out what the best approach of this is. From my perspective, most likely something along the lines of Ludonericon, which is a similar concept to the Steam Games Festival, but with a strong focus on a specific genre, in this case, like more of a narrative take. But that's up for a discussion. We'll see how what the natural path of this evolution will be.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of, I forgot where I saw this a while ago, but for like Skyrim, there's guides in terms of how to properly prioritize like all these side quests that you can do in the in Skyrim. And now it's going to be like someone writing a guide like how to prioritize like what you care about with all these game festivals from a player perspective. Like just sensory overload. Like you said, it's a good point though, because it's like when there's so much out there and available. I mean, sometimes I feel like this when I'm like browsing online to make a purchase of something. It's like, there's too much. I just need that like something that and I mean curation as a whole in terms of how we just user behavior and stuff is a big deal outside of games and stuff. But yeah, it's another area where I think from a player's perspective, as you mentioned, that might be a challenge in itself, but it's kind of a cool challenge to have, I would say.
100%. I remember back in the early or late 2013s, I believe, early 2014s. I think to remember that was the time frame when the PlayStation 4 came out, either late 2013 or late 2014. Either way, just looking up on the storefront every week, every Tuesday or Thursday, whenever PlayStation back then were updating their storefront and seeing 1 to maybe 3 titles release every week. So this whole growth of game content available is obviously just a natural evolution. What I'm most curious about is how the transition from digital B2C to in-person B2C events will occur and what kind of major changes we might be seeing.
Yeah.
Especially now that Ubisoft has their Ubisoft Forward, I believe it's called. EA has their own online live streams. Basically, all the major players are doing their own online conferences and activations through either their own launchers or marketplaces such as Steam and the Epic Game Store. They are getting a new perspective of what they may be able to get out of a major marketing spend, a major marketing bump for, I would assume, significantly less financial investment than they might do by going to physical events. So I could see the whole trend that we've been seeing with E3 over the last couple of years, where some of the major players have been dropping out and just doing their own types of events. Mm-hmm. I could see that continue to some extent because they just have been forced into trying out something new and have figured for themselves that, well, at the end of the day, the data tells them it's worth it for them to focus on their own activations where there's less overall buzz than maybe during a Gamescom week. But that's just a theory. We'll see.
Cool.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And E3 was actually like what came to mind for me too, because a lot of the kind of shift that we're seeing is something that was already kind of being built towards before anything this year really even took place. Like with, the accessibility of like game demos as part of special like E3 promotions and stuff like that. In addition to even like you said, bigger teams like even Nintendo had a presence at E3, but they stopped doing the big press conferences and started doing their own digital events to announce games and stuff like that. And then, we kind of see how, like, I guess it's just another way that games, seemingly above just about any other medium, were somehow prepared for this like global crisis. But it's just fascinating that this is now something that is like a requirement, but it's something that seemingly we were already kind of building in that direction anyway, which is, almost ironic in a way, because E3, who kind of were helping to start pioneer some of that, kind of tagged out. But, all the same.
So I think these things that we just talked about too, and in light of like pretty much how much is available, what like now other publishers and entities are having their own events, and since we talked about before, even from a player perspective, this can be kind of overwhelming. So taking this a step further from indie studios and devs, like outside of just attending whatever these events are, whether they're being represented by a publisher or not, what would you say are some other solutions or ideas that you could think of, Chris, for devs to better stand out? Because if there's now, it's probably better curated content, curated games and such, but there's still a lot of them, and players are being like, their attention is going to be pretty limited with so much out there. So what are better ways that devs can stand out, knowing of how this digital landscape is kind of forming right now?
Just to clarify, are you speaking about standing out in a events environment, or overall sort of in like a marketing,
I would say
community outreach environment?
Why don't we break it down into two parts? I would say, definitely on the event side. Let's just focus on the event side too, because the marketing aspect can go into a lot of other different areas that could be its own episode in itself. So yeah, let's just, because we're so focused about events right now, let's talk about how devs can better stand out, especially in a more digital landscape, and even if anything comes up too on physical events too, even though that's probably further down the pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Very good question. For me, and that might be sounding a little bit weird coming from an events organizer, it's all about focus. So I have, the overall motto being all in or nothing. So instead of limiting your resources, spreading out your resources across 5 events over the period of 2 months, I'd be focusing on 1 or 2 with a much higher commitment, not necessarily financially, but from how much time and energy and creativity you can spend on these digital events. Very much depends on which platforms we're talking, which tools are available to you, what kind of relationship you may be having to the events organizer or to the owner of the platform on which the event might be being hosted, such as, again, Valve as a good example. But I would always be looking at what are the opportunities being represented or presented to me and the other dozens, if not hundreds, of developers that will be participating, and thinking outside of the box. What can I do in addition to that, or as a alternative to what's being offered, to really stand out? You don't want to be swimming I think this might be a German phrase that really poorly translate into English, but I'll give it a shot. You don't want to be swimming alongside everyone else in a pond, but sort of figuring out your own, I guess, like finding your own smaller pond to swim within. That sounds really bad.
No. Well,
I hope that somewhat makes sense.
Yeah, like you don't want to, if you're trying to figure out things for yourself, you don't want to like do it in a group among many. You usually want to experiment kind of like on your own, opposed to with everybody else, because then what they do can help, may shape how you ultimately decide to do things, right? Something along those lines.
Exactly. And it's not about gatekeeping or keeping the information to yourself. I think it's super important in this industry to help each other out, to have an active communication with your peers. But at the very beginning of this, it's called an experiment. I think it's super important to just try out new things that are not being presented to you. If there's a bullet point list of here 7 ways we're going to drive players or consumers to your title, and this is what you can do to be a part of, definitely valid to participate in those, but you have to keep in mind that this same list is being sent over to